September of 1861 marked a turning point here at the fort. During that month, the first prisoners arrived here. There were 53 of them, and they were former Union soldiers who had been convicted by courts-martial. They had performed a variety of crimes, from mutiny and murder to theft and disobedience. But all their sentences called for them to perform hard labor at the Dry Tortugas. The prison population here at Fort Jefferson continued to grow as the war went on, especially after 1864, because in that year, President Lincoln changed the crime for desertion from death to hard labor at the Dry Tortugas. At its peak, 882 men were imprisoned here, and that was in November of 1864. They represented the unpaid labor force that continued to help build the structure and the interior buildings. The residents and soldiers here at Fort Jefferson learned about the surrender of General Lee and the effective end of the Civil War on April 20th, 1865. There was immediately an immense celebration with a 200-gun salute. However, the next day, a steamship came with its flag at half-mast, and it was then that the people here learned that President Lincoln had been shot. Their period of celebration was turned to mourning, but some of the prisoners here, some of those disloyal Union soldiers, celebrated Lincoln's death, and as a result, they were severely punished. Those men were strung up by their thumbs outside the guardhouse and left all day. They were strung up so long that even after they were cut down, one of the men died. But one of the soldiers here who witnessed it had no sympathy for him, because he felt, how could one be so joyful after such a national calamity?
In Washington, D.C., justice for President Lincoln came swiftly. The lead assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was cornered and killed 12 days after firing the fatal shot at Ford's Theater. Several of Booth's co-conspirators were rounded up and imprisoned. On May 9, 1865, less than a month after Lincoln's death, the trial of the Lincoln conspirators began. Rather than receiving a civil trial, the 8 conspirators were tried by a military court, with a jury composed of 9 military officers. By June 30th, the judges had reached their verdicts. 4 of the conspirators were executed. 3 received life sentences, and 1 was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The 4 conspirators who avoided the hangman's noose were Edmund Spangler, the Ford's Theater stagehand who briefly held Booth's horse at the scene of the crime, Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin, former Confederate soldiers and friends of Booth's who signed on to his initial plot to abduct President Lincoln, and Dr. Samuel A. Mudd. Dr. Mudd had met Booth when the future assassin traveled into southern Maryland, scouting the routes he planned to take with the kidnapped president. Dr. Mudd had helped Booth in making contact with members of the Confederate underground. After the assassination, John Wilkes Booth received medical assistance for his broken leg from the good doctor. The original life sentences for Mudd, Arnold, and O'Laughlin, and the 6-year sentence for Spangler, stated that they were to serve their time at the federal penitentiary in Albany, New York. On July 17th, the prisoners were steamed down the Potomac River and into the Chesapeake Bay. They reached Fort Monroe in Virginia. Like Fort Jefferson, Fort Monroe was one of the few southern forts that was held by the Union throughout the war. At Fort Monroe, the prisoners were transferred to a steamship named the USS Florida. As they exited the Chesapeake Bay and turned southward, the conspirators realized that they were not headed to New York. When they were south of South Carolina, the captain of the Florida informed the conspirators that their place of imprisonment had been changed to that of Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas. The Florida arrived at Garden Key Harbor on July 24th. The conspirators were placed in a small boat and conveyed to the fort. Here they joined the rest of the prison population.
Fort Jefferson was first and foremost a military fort built to protect America's waterways. It was never intended to be a prison. As a result, there are no traditional cells here at Fort Jefferson. The prison population had to be put somewhere, so they were placed here in the second-tier casemates overlooking the ocean. Individual partitions were built to board up different parts of the casemates here in order to house the prison population. At the time of the conspirators' arrival, there were still around 500 prisoners being held at Fort Jefferson. These large archways that empty out into the parade ground were also boarded up, leaving only window-size openings for ventilation and light. On the other side of the cell, the casemate opens up onto the sea. Now today there are these huge archways giving gorgeous views of the water and beyond. But it didn't quite look like this in the 1860s. You see, just like the floor above and the bottom floor, this floor was designed to hold cannons, as we can see from a mounting station ready to put a cannon. But cannons were never actually mounted on the second tier anywhere. And so if we had traveled back in time, we would find the opening not so large. It would have been just a square to door size hole, which would give a place for the cannons to shoot through. But over time, natural erosion effects have caused the bricks to break in, giving us these gorgeous views. Here's a part of the fort where we can get a better idea of what the view was like for the conspirators. Here we can see that the one layer of brick has not completely broken through in this entire casemate, and only parts of it down here and over here. But this would have been the shot of what the conspirators could look upon and the other prisoners when they looked out into the ocean. Since no prisoner was allowed to be idle, all the conspirators were assigned different duties. Dr. Mudd, as a doctor, was assigned duty at the prison hospital. Now, a separate hospital building had been planned for Fort Jefferson, but it was never built. Instead, 2 rooms at the end of the still unfinished soldiers' barracks were set aside as the post hospital. I'm standing in what was once the doorway into these hospital rooms. Dr. Mudd was assigned here as an assistant nurse in this small ward. During this initial period, Dr. Mudd complained that he had little labor to do and that he was bored by the assignment.
Emily Holder, the wife of the post doctor, wrote about an incident that is missing from all of Dr. Mudd's published letters home. According to Mrs. Holder, her husband was eating lunch one day when the hospital steward came rushing in, saying 2 men in the hospital were dying. When Dr. Holder arrived, he discovered 2 patients writhing in agony and screaming of internal pain. While Dr. Holder was away, the head nurse had left Dr. Mudd in charge, with instructions to give these 2 patients some medicine at a designated time. Dr. Mudd told Dr. Holder that he had done as the nurse had asked. Confused at the pain the patients were suffering from, Dr. Holder asked Dr. Mudd to show him the medicine he had given the men. Dr. Mudd produced a bottle that contained Spanish fly, a strong irritant that is used externally to produce blistering on the skin. In time, Dr. Holder was able to relieve the men of their suffering, but they felt that Dr. Mudd had deliberately tried to poison them. Dr. Holder was certain that the whole incident had been an accident, and that Dr. Mudd had merely picked up the wrong bottle by mistake. Still, according to Emily Holder, Dr. Mudd lost his position at the post hospital due to this incident.
Samuel Arnold was an educated man. During his time in the Confederate Army, he actually performed office work in the Bureau of Niter and Mining. When he was arrested for his involvement with Booth, Arnold was employed as a clerk at Fort Monroe. His neat handwriting and familiarity with the paperwork of military life made him a perfect asset here at Fort Jefferson, where he became a clerk in the Provost Marshal's office. Having made his living as a carpenter in John T. Fort's theaters, Edmund Spengler was well acquainted with the construction projects going on at the fort. As such, he was assigned duty as a laborer, carpenter, and just generally helping to continue to build the structure. Michael O'Laughlin likewise found himself assigned work as a laborer. However, he had experience as an ornamental plasterer in Baltimore, and so likely his skills were put to use putting down the plaster in the unfinished soldiers' barracks in here, which was the officers' quarters.
On August 17, 1865, Colonel Lafayette Baker sent a telegram to the War Department alerting them that he had uncovered details of a plot regarding the conspirators at the Dry Tortugas. Baker was the leader of the National Detective Police and was the man who had organized the troops that had successfully tracked and captured John Wilkes Booth. Baker claimed he heard from a reliable source that a party was organizing in New Orleans to come and free the conspirators by force. He suggested that all efforts be made to secure the prisoners. His information was passed along and was received at the fort on August 24th. Captain William Prentice was the commander of the fort at the time, having just recently arrived with his men. He wrote back to the War Department explaining the readiness and the discipline of the fort's garrison to repel any possible plot.
The idea that an armed raid to free the conspirators would be successful was frankly a ludicrous one. The fort was now more heavily armed than it had been during the Civil War. If a ship had come anywhere close in an attempt to enact a mass prison break, they would have been taken care of by the fort's many guns. Still, if they were concerned, Captain Prentice suggested to the War Department that they could send a gunboat to patrol the area if they thought it would help. When it came to the internal security of the conspirators, Captain Prentice relayed the systems already in place. No prisoner was allowed outside the fort after sunset, and they were restricted to their quarters after dusk. There were regular patrols of both the fort and the moat throughout the night. And here, in the Sally Port, the sole entrance and exit to the fort, there was guards at all times. Captain Prentice was confident that the conspirators were well guarded. Despite Captain Prentice's assertions that the conspirators were well guarded, the lieutenant who hand-delivered Colonel Baker's warning to the fort did not believe that the fort's security was as had been portrayed. Lieutenant Gilbert Carpenter wrote his own letter to the Assistant Secretary of War, citing the multiple security concerns he had observed.
At that time, the separate soldiers' barracks building had not been completed, and thus the soldiers were housed and slept inside the second-tier casemates right behind it. The guardhouse was located next to the Sally Port entrance. Between the two were the casemates occupied by the almost 500 prisoners. Lieutenant Carpenter expressed his concern that a number of prisoners could easily overpower and seize the weaponry at the guardhouse before the rest of the garrison could come to their aid. This was troubling, as even Commander Prentice recognized that he only had about 275 soldiers available to meet any emergency. If a general uprising were to take place, the prisoners had the numbers over the soldiers. Still, there wasn't much fear of a large prison break, as there would have been no way for the entire prison population to get off the island at the same time.
Small-scale escape attempts did occur, however. Lieutenant Carpenter cited that there were 3 small barges here in the moat just underneath the casemates occupied by the prisoners. He was concerned that some enterprising prisoner would try to lower himself down from the casemate, steal one of the barges, and sail it out of one of the many holes in the seawall. Now, this was not an unreasonable concern. During the Civil War years, several prisoners waited until the cover of darkness, eluded the guards and the patrols monitoring the island, and stole the small boats and rowboats belonging to the fort and made their escape. Stories even tell of prisoners taking to the water and swimming with just wooden boards or other objects for flotation. The swimmers set their sights there, to Loggerhead Key, 3 miles distant. During the fort's history, Loggerhead was used sometimes to isolate soldiers when disease struck the fort, but largely it was sparsely inhabited by just the lighthouse keeper and his family. Those who made the long swim to Loggerhead would steal one of the lighthouse keeper's boats and set sail.
While several prisoners who attempted to escape by stealing boats were discovered and chased when their vessels were sighted on the horizon in the morning, some eluded notice and recapture, but their fates after sailing away from the Tortugas are unknown. The now free prisoners found themselves in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, with the closest inhabited lands being Key West, some 68 miles away to the east, and Havana, Cuba, over 100 miles to the south. Without help from local fishermen, it's likely that most prisoners who stole boats to escape ultimately perished in the open ocean.